Ngā mihi o te ahi ahi, good afternoon. And we move on now in our topic of market equilibrium and changes. And now we're going to analyze the market using different terminology. Same changes, but we're going to apply new terminology to the analysis. And the main focus on equilibrium now is on why allocative efficiency is achieved at market equilibrium. So the concepts we're going to focus on are consumer surplus, producer surplus, and also this strange term deadweight loss. But you will have to hold your breath for that. Firstly, we need to look at some other things. So let's remind ourselves about how we've defined market equilibrium up to now. We know it's the intersection point of the supply and demand curves, and it occurs there because at market equilibrium, quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. In other words, there's no shortage, so there is not an insufficient amount of resources being allocated, and there's no surplus. There are not too many resources being allocated, and so it's not being overproduced. So that market price and quantity is the right price because resources are allocated efficiently. Now we're going to use this new terminology to expand our definition of market equilibrium. But before we do that, let's look at the following. Now markets of private goods will achieve allocative efficiency when they reach equilibrium, because resources will be firstly fully utilized. In other words, will be operating on the production possibility frontier or curve. And secondly, each market, whatever market is involved in that production of goods, will provide the quantity of goods and services that consumers demand. So we say there are two requirements or conditions to achieve allocative efficiency. All available resources must be utilized, fully utilized. In other words, production efficiency must be achieved, and all markets will be in equilibrium. In other words, consumers get what they demand. Points A and B represent production efficiency. All resources are fully utilized. Now the next part of our requirement is harder to find without further information, because both A and B are productively efficient. We're on the curve, resources are being fully used, but we don't know whether 100 cars or 60 cars is required by the market, or 100 televisions or 200 televisions are required in the television market. So we need to know where market equilibrium is in both those markets. And of course, we can see here that at A, we would have an excess supply of cars. There would be a surplus because the market only wants 60 cars. And when we look at the market for televisions, 200 televisions are required, which means that if we produced at A, there would be a shortage of 100 televisions. So we simply look for what consumers are demanding in each market, and then we find the corresponding numbers in our production possibility curve. So as we can see, point B is not only productively efficient, but also allocatively efficient. Now let's use our two models, graphical models, to show how a change in a market will lead to a reallocation of resources. Resources will be transferred to meet the demands of the market. So again, we have two products being produced, sausages and other food. and we're producing at point A. Why are we producing there? Because that is where the market is in equilibrium. That's how many sausages and other food is required. Well, we don't know about other food, but we do know how many sausages are required, and the market is in equilibrium. Now, if demand increased for sausages, the demand curve will shift right, and this will result in a shortage equal to Q, or Q1 minus Q. To remove the shortage, the sausage price must increase, and this will make producers want to increase quantity supplied. The production possibility curve, if we look at the right here, at points A and B, show production efficiency has been achieved because resources are fully employed. We're on the curve. Consequently, because resources are fully employed, if we want to produce more sausages, we have to reallocate resources away from other food in order to increase quantity supplied. So in this way, we've just seen how a market, changes in the market, will lead to a reallocation of resources. Once again, don't forget to utilize these video links with Professor Stephen King from Monash University, who takes you through each of the models and takes you in a way that provides an alternative explanation that will deepen your understanding of these graphical models. Now we arrive at our new terminology. Firstly, consumer surplus. Now here, surplus hasn't got a negative connotation like it had when in a market where you have a surplus, because there it meant there was excess supply, there was too much being produced. But here, surplus is rather positive. It's something that comes to the consumer when they consume goods and services that provides an extra benefit or utility. Remembering, utility is the satisfaction that comes from buying goods and services. So our definition, and it's one you should learn, consumer surplus is the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay, the actual market price. So you can see there, equilibrium occurs at $5 in our diagram, the arrow pointing there. So we say that where you find or model consumer surplus on our graph, it is always the area below the demand curve and above the price line. So as you can see there, at $5 would be the price. So as we look at why this is an extra benefit or surplus, we can see the consumer is willing to buy 1 unit for $8, 2 units for $7, 3 units for $6, and 5 units for $5. But the consumer actually gets to pay $5 for all those units because that's the market price. He was willing to pay $8 for the first unit and $7 for the second and $6 for the third, but he's actually getting these units at a lower price than he was willing to pay because the market price is $5. Therefore, we say this triangle represents an extra benefit or utility, which we call consumer surplus. Now you can imagine, for example, if the price went down to $4, the area of the triangle would increase. The yellow area represents the increase in consumer surplus because the price has gone down. So instead of paying $8 for the first unit, he was willing to pay that. He was getting $5, now he has to pay $4. So this is what is known as consumer surplus. Let's analyze it a little bit more closely, and we can see the market price is $5, and we can see the triangle representing consumer surplus. Now let's analyze why. Now we know that the total utility of consuming 20 units is the area under the triangle up to the quantity, under the demand curve, up to the quantity 20 units. So if we calculated, that's what we would get. Now the total cost of those 20 units is, of course, how much the consumer paid, $5, and bought 20 units. So total consumer spending or expenditure, which is total revenue to producers in this case, is the same, is equal to 5 times 20. So the consumer only spent $100, but he was willing to spend more. So the difference, the extra utility or marginal utility of consuming 20 units, represents the consumer surplus. So if we made a formula, total utility would equal consumer surplus plus consumer or total expenditure. Now what we see here are changes to consumer surplus when the demand curve shifts. In the first example, we can see an outward shift in the demand curve. In other words, there is an increase in demand. And we can measure the change by the original CS at P1 was this area here, this triangle. When the price goes up, there is a decrease in consumer surplus. but there is also a gain or increase in consumer surplus represented by that. So the overall change of an increase in demand will be an increase in consumer surplus. If the supply curve shifts to the right, in the second diagram we can see there's an increase in supply. The resulting price decrease means, of course, that consumer surplus will increase. So this area here will represent the increase in consumer surplus. Now, fortunately for you, the examiner doesn't really ask you to identify these changes in consumer surplus with shifts in either the demand or the supply curve. So that makes it a little bit easier. But this slide and the next one will help you understand how do I recognize it and identify it more easily. Don't forget, we've got those links of Stephen King for you to widen your scope and deepen your understanding of these models that I'm teaching you. So don't hesitate to look at them when you have some time. Now again, when we talk about our next new piece of vocab, producer surplus, with which we analyze our graphical models of market equilibrium and changes. Producer surplus again it's a positive idea. It's not the idea of excess supply. It's more to do with an extra benefit measured by extra revenue the producer might get. And so we define it, and again it's a good one to memorize, the difference between what producers are willing to accept in payment, in other words the price they're willing to sell, and the actual price they receive. And you can see in the diagram the producer surplus is the area above the supply curve and below the price, the market price that's set. So the producer's willing to take $1 for the first 10 units, but he actually gets more. He's willing to take $2 for the next 20 units, remembering his marginal cost is rising, but he actually gets a higher price. Next 10 units, he's willing to sell at $3, he actually gets a higher price. Next 10 units, he's willing to sell for $4 as his marginal cost is still rising, and so he actually gets paid $5 for those 50 units. So this represents an extra benefit or extra revenue the producer gets, because he's willing to sell at a price equal to his marginal cost, but he's actually getting $5 for all of those units when his marginal cost is lower than that. Of course, if the demand curve shifts up to the right, the price will rise, and that will make him happy, or happier, because now he's going to even get more for those 50 units. So there will be an increase in producer surplus represented by that shaded area. So a closer analysis, if we look at the total revenue of selling 50 units, remembering he's getting $5 for all those units, is 5 times 50. Now the total cost of producing 50 units is the area under the triangle. That represents, remember, the marginal cost times the price. And so we arrive at total cost and divided by 2 because it's a triangle. And finally, the difference between total revenue and total cost, as you already know, is, we could call it profit, but here we call it this extra revenue gained is producer surplus. So here we can see the purple or indigo triangle representing consumer surplus, and the red area underneath the supply curve representing total cost. Again, a little bit more analysis. If supply increases, how does that affect producer surplus? Well, there's going to be a loss of consumer surplus represented by that area there, but there's going to be a gain represented by that area there. So the overall change, the net change, should be that producer surplus will increase when the supply curve shifts to the right, even though the price falls. Now it's time to revisit our definition of equilibrium and expand it to incorporate these new terms of consumer and producer surplus. So when markets reach equilibrium by themselves, and the goods are private goods. Now this term private will be explained when we get to section B, but for the moment, for all goods which are considered to be private goods in this part of the course, when the market reaches equilibrium, resources will be allocated efficiently. So market equilibrium represents the allocatively efficient point. So when markets reach equilibrium, market equilibrium means or equals allocative efficiency. What does that mean? It means quantity demanded equals quantity supplied, so there's no surplus, there's no shortage in the market. So the correct quantity of resources are being allocated. Now to bring in our new terminology, market equilibrium is also where consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized. They can't get any bigger. Benefits to consumers and producers are at their maximum, at their greatest. Alternatively, we could define it like this. It's known as the Pareto optimum, something you don't have to remember, but the actual definition, the description, is very useful. No one can be made better off without making someone else worse off. Sometimes this is used as a choice in multiple choice, and it's a very complete definition. Even if you don't fully understand it, it is a very complete definition. And the last one also could be a way of defining market equilibrium, where the market price includes all the costs and all the benefits of producing and consuming the good or service. And this again we will revisit in section B. So once completed, you'll have a better understanding of what this last definition means, and of course you'll be able to apply it then. So if we take our graph, the one that we've already used to make our definition of market equilibrium, so now we can add market equilibrium is also where consumer surplus and producer surplus are maximized. Don't forget to, if you have time, to have a look at that video link, which will give us some more detail on these two concepts and market equilibrium.